Harris supports more of America's enemies than she does her friends. And that fact, my friends, has seriously biblical implications. All right, folks, let's get into this one. I want to say that when I saw this article in the Jerusalem Post, it literally just brought back all kinds of crazy feelings in my mind concerning Kamala Harris. And I want to simply say that before we get into this particular issue, I want to remind everybody that I recently did a video that partially covers the subject that we're dealing with today. In that, I walked you through the speech that Kamala Harris gave immediately after meeting with Bibi Netanyahu, because that speech was extraordinarily telling with respect to her view, not only concerning the United States of America, but her view concerning Israel. Now, of course, we all know this. Israel is America's greatest ally in the Middle East, and yet it would seem as though this current administration has no regard or respect for Israel, and certainly has no regard for the security or the interests of the United States of America in that region, and it continues to show its ugly face. I will tell you this, that when I made that video regarding Kamala, a lot of people said, she's not as ignorant as you say she is, James. It's very likely that what she is doing here is intentional. And I would have to say that based on so much of the evidence that I am seeing, especially as preparing for this video, I am recognizing that it is absolutely, without a doubt, a lot more intentional than it is a result of ignorance. And that, my friends, makes this situation terribly worse. Now, I want to say this before we get into this article, and that is the fact that Kamala Harris has always been somebody who has supported enemies of Americans more than she has supported the friends of Americans, and she certainly supports those who are sympathetic towards evil more than she will ever support those who choose to embrace good. We saw evidence of this several years back as people were running through the streets and they were rioting, and not only was she encouraging them to do so, and not only was she inciting the type of behavior that is absolutely reprehensible, she was even soliciting money from donors who would pay into a fund that would actually help to bail many of these people out of prison who were doing all of these illegal things, including destroying infrastructures that protect and feed into the very people that she claimed she was helping. It's amazing, by the way, when you think about the rioting that went on during that time, the rioting that Kamala Harris supported, an overwhelming majority of that rioting that was happening was destroying the very communities that she claimed to be defending. And in reality, all she did was brought death and destruction and pain and suffering to so many people. And of course, this comes from this ugly mindset that she has learned and developed through a group of parents who believe in a totalitarian way of thinking. Her mom and dad were very much aggressive and very well-trained Marxists who passed on so much of those ugly sentiments to her, and she carries it on. And let me just simply say this, we don't even need to get into the significance of how badly she destroyed the areas that she was over. She helped to destroy the great state of California. Being a resident of California, I can vouch to that. And she undoubtedly destroyed San Francisco. San Francisco used to be one of the prettiest and most exceptional cities in the country. It has now become one of the worst cities in the country. And so much of that was done at the hands of Kamala Harris and many people who are her sympathizers. Now, I bring all of this up because she is now running to become the president of the United States, and the destructive effort that that is going to bring to the table in solidifying the downward direction that the United States of America is headed is something that is just unbelievable. And it's amazing to me how so many of these facts are being ignored. By the way, let me remind you, Kamala Harris was not voted into this position. She may have been voted into office because people voted for Joe Biden and she came with the package. But the reality of it is she was not voted in through the primaries. In reality, it was Joe Biden that was voted in for the primaries, and she was voted in as the VP, which in essence, in the mind of so many people, is a very inconsequential position. Yet, in this place, we have seen it become very consequential for a whole lot of reasons. Now, with all of that said, I don't need to get into more detail concerning the destructive efforts that have been made by Kamala. I don't have to get into all the craziness that we have been seeing. But the one thing that I should point out that I think is very, very scary on many levels is the fact that Kamala Harris is seeking to go down a road right now, especially with respect to her perceived foreign policy, that is going to destroy a lot of people's way of life. It's going to destroy the very country that we live in and that we cherish and value. And it is certainly going to destroy their very security and safety. So let me read this article to you. This is in the Jerusalem Post, and it says this, and it's, by the way, I want to just point this out. It is a correctly entitled article. It should be entitled this way because it is very valid. And yes, although you'll find this in the opinion section of the Jerusalem Post, it has a tremendous amount of very valid arguments for why this opinion is being rendered as such, and it creates all of these things to facts that are already stipulated to. In other words, nobody is debating the facts that are being brought up in this article because they're clear, and the record is very clear to show all of these things, but it is still nonetheless unbelievable when it's contextualized the way that we're going to see it contextualized here. So let me read this to you. The title of the article says, Kamala Harris is appeasing Hamas. Okay? Now, let me just simply say this in response to that simple title. You think? Okay? Of course she's appeasing Hamas, just like so many other people are doing it, which, by the way, I will tell you, a week from today, maybe 2 weeks from today, I'm not sure when it's going to happen in the production schedule, I cannot wait to produce an interview for you that I'm going to provide a lot of commentary on, that is conducted by Jordan Peterson with a man who is the leading expert on urban warfare in the world. And the things that he has to say are going to be mind-boggling and eye-opening with respect to the things that are happening in Israel, specifically in Gaza and with Hamas. A lot of things to be said here. But with that said, I want to make myself very, very clear. The appeasement that Harris is continuing to pursue with respect to Hamas and Hezbollah, for that matter, and even Iran, is one that is putting the United States of America on a very direct path to destruction, not just simply because of the fact that it puts us in a less strategic position, and not simply because it decreases our security in the Middle East and all of the areas around, but also because when we read in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, especially in verse 3, we read that if you curse Israel, God is going to curse you. And that certainly applies to nations. And as this nation continues to be led by people who have a very deep-rooted hate for Israel, then, of course, it puts our nation in a very, very bad position. And undoubtedly, we are moving into a direction that is going to be ultimately destructive of everything the United States of America has ever stood for. So let me read this. It says this. Last March, Harris called for an immediate ceasefire, those are the quotes here, in Gaza that would have thrown a lifeline to Hamas. She also warned Israel not to invade Hamas's last stronghold in Rafah. By the way, that's a whole funny joke when that whole thing happened. And there's a lot to be said about how she tried to handle Rafah and how she's completely ignorant and incapable of even doing that. But look what it goes on to say. It says, Vice President Kamala Harris's decision to skip Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's recent speech to a joint session of Congress was glaring. At a historically sensitive time for Israel, granted, Israel's at war, okay? The prime minister's speech reverberated with the objectives and moral clarity on Israel's war against Hamas and the need to confront Iran. By the way, it's interesting because one of the things that Netanyahu did, which, by the way, I did a video that covers the whole speech that Netanyahu did. I think it was a remarkable one. I also covered the a story on the disgusting decision that Kamala Harris made not to be there, which, by the way, it was her constitutionally mandated responsibility to be there because she is the VP, which means she presides over all of Congress. That's a whole other story, and there's a lot to be said about that. She is certainly somebody who is not a stranger to walking away from the responsibilities that are constitutionally mandated for her in her position. She did that as Attorney General. She's done that in many of the positions that she's had. She is somebody who has continually walked in dereliction of the duty that has been entrusted to her, but that's a whole different story. Look what it goes on to say. It says, the speech showed Israel's foes, friends, and potential friends the extent of the support for Israel among a large majority of Americans. And that is, of course, very true. The large majority of Americans continue to support, wisely so, the nation of Israel because they deserve our support, and God has told us to support them. But look what it goes on to say. Harris's absence, however, crystallized growing concerns about the trajectory of U.S.-Israel relations if she wins the elections in November. And yes, that is a big if she wins, but certainly there is great concern because if she wins the election in November, the relationship we have with Israel is completely dead. And right now it's already hanging off of a thread. Look what it goes on to say. Her statement following the meeting with Netanyahu made Israel supporters cringe. I'm one of them that cringed. As a matter of fact, I made a video addressing it because her statements were absolutely wicked. They were evil and they were unrighteous. They were filled with lies, and the type of sort of moral clarity she thought she was bringing made everything completely muddy. It was very dark, very evil, very unjust, and very wicked. The article goes on to say here, let's continue on. It says, unjustly putting the blame on Israel for mass civilian casualties and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza was almost as bad as the vice president's outrageous comparison between Israel and Hamas. And that is so true. She literally lectured Israel on the right to self-determination and security and all the other things that she threw out for Hamas, yet at the same time not mentioning for 1 second Israel's right to self-determination and all of the things that should go with the fact that Israel is a legitimate state that deserves to be able to have their own security and to be able to function peaceably in their own land. As a matter of fact, what Kamala Harris did in those 6.5 minutes worth of remarks was she pretty much delegitimized the position of Israel by continuing to contend for the fact that so many innocent lives were suffering in Gaza somehow at the hand of Israel, when in reality, none of it had anything to do with being at the hand of Israel, and all of it had everything to do with the idea that Gaza finds lots of joy and happiness and peace in making their people the human shields so that they could capitalize upon the perceptions that exist amongst people as they see this in the media. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, and I'll make myself very, very, very clear. If you want to sit down and have a conversation with Hamas, you might as well be simply asking yourself to perish, because the reality of it is there is no reasoning with Hamas. Think about it like this. People keep going to Israel and saying, you should invite Hamas to the dinner table. And the problem is, I will invite virtually anybody to the dinner table. As a matter of fact, I think Israel should invite anybody to the dinner table. And you might sit down and you have a meal together, but the one person you don't want to invite to the dinner table is a cannibal. And Israel inviting Hamas to the dinner table is like inviting a cannibal to come eat with you, because what's going to happen is that cannibal is going to eat you. And Kamala Harris wants Israel to have dinner with cannibals that will seek to eat them. And the reality is, as you examine all of this, you look at the facts, you realize it for what it is, there's no justification for Kamala's position on this, because she has absolutely no idea how significantly damaging this can be for the country. Actually, I'm going to back up for just a second and say maybe she does have an idea of how damaging this can be for the country, and that makes things even worse. Look at this next sentence in the article, and this article speaks volumes. Ready? In reality, Harris is appeasing Hamas, and boy, is that true. She is undoubtedly appeasing Hamas in doing this. Look what it goes on to say. Looking to end the war in Gaza is understandable, but wanting Hamas to stay in power is not. And I think this is the thing that the writer of this article completely understands, and something we need to get the rest of the world to understand. There's no such thing as ending the war in Gaza when Hamas still has control over Gaza. Quite frankly, there's no ending the war in Gaza if the Palestinian Authority is rendered control over Gaza, because it's going to be history in the making. And we have to stop for a moment and we have to contemplate the reality of all of this. Again, you don't invite cannibals to dinner. And I think that the thing that people have to realize was that Israel had not occupied Gaza in October the 6th. There was nobody in Gaza at that point. But October the 7th changed everything. There was a ceasefire. Prior to October the 7th, there was nothing going on. And even in the times when they were firing rockets from Gaza, Israel was, for the most part, even ignoring many of those things and utilizing the Iron Dome to protect their positions. But yet, what happened? It made an attack that was unprecedented, the worst since the Holocaust. And what this has resulted in is a lot of destruction, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of hardship. And Israel cannot invite a cannibal to dinner. They cannot do it. Israel has to fight back. They must. You cannot have peace in Gaza unless these people are removed. By the way, it is really interesting to consider the fact that no other nation wants any of these people as refugees. And that's something that's a very important point to bring out, and something to bring out to people who might not be aware of some of the ideas of this. You look at Egypt alone. Egypt wants nothing to do with Islamic Brotherhood. Remember, when you look at Hamas, they came out of Islamic Brotherhood. Nobody wants anything to do with any of that stuff. And that's a very well-known fact in the Middle East. Look at what it goes on to say. For the war to end, Israel needs to destroy Hamas in Gaza and address the underlying poisonous ideology of the population through a process of de-radicalization. And that's actually very, very true. By the way, as a matter of fact, I wouldn't call it de-radicalization. I would call it defundamentalization. That's what I would call it. Because if you are somebody who believes in the fundamentals of the Quran, then you will believe in the terminology that you see reflected in the charter of Hamas. So this is not a hard thing to understand, which, by the way, let me remind you, when you look at the Quran encourages you to be a deceiver. I'll quote it to you. I'll quote you one of these passages that I have read again and again and again and again and again in Arabic. And it says this is in the Quran, 354. It says, وَمَكُرُ وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ خَيْرَ الْمَكَرِينَ. Okay? That basically means Allah is the chief of deceivers. I don't know why this is such a difficult thing for people to understand. The very precedent that Hamas is settling into is one that involves the type of lies that are being communicated in order to change people's perceptions based on things that are factually unstipulated to and things that are completely not true. This is what they do. Look what it goes on to say. Rebuilding Gaza while allowing Hamas to remain in power is delusional, and it is delusional. Gaza cannot be rebuilt as long as Hamas remains. After spending the billions of donated funds since 2007 to turn Gaza into a terrorist wonderland, the idea that this time Hamas will act differently only perpetuates the failed approach that prevailed before October the 7th and will only lead to another war down the road. And by the way, I just have to say this is true. You know what Hamas did with all that money that was sent by the largest terrorist organization in the world, the UN? You know what Hamas did with all the money that was sent by Iran and all the money that was sent by everybody else? They built 400 miles of terrorist tunnels. 400 miles, almost all of which are under schools and hospitals and the homes of civilians. It was designed to create the condition. We see Hamas leaders saying, we love death. Israel loves life. That's the problem. And I think it's such a critical juncture that we are in right now to recognize what's going on. I love what this article does, because this article does something for us that's really important, and it contextualizes the very troubling policy on Israel that Kamala Harris has had in the past years. Look at what it says here. Harris's troubling policy on Israel is not new. During a visit to George Mason University in 2021, a student protested that Israel was conducting an ethnic genocide in Palestine. Instead of debunking these preposterous claims, which facts, Harris responded, your voice, your perspective, your experience, your truth cannot be suppressed, and it must be heard. Now she says, I won't be silenced. This is the kind of nonsense, this Marxist, cultural Marxist nonsense that continues to show its ugly face. And Kamala has always been good at this. Look what the next paragraph says. Last March, Harris called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza that would have thrown a lifeline to Hamas. She also warned Israel not to invade Hamas's last stronghold in Rafah. I have studied the maps, she proclaimed, and they, civilians, have nowhere to go. Okay, she was saying nonsense like this when Israel was getting ready to go to Khan Yunis. She was saying this type of thing when these things were happening in the north. The reality of it is, the way that Hamas does these things, these civilians never had anywhere to go. And as a matter of fact, considering the way that Hamas booby traps the lives of these civilians, we understand for a fact that Israel has done a remarkable job in minimizing the kind of civilian death and casualties that happen as a result of this level of urban warfare, which, by the way, in Israel is very unique in this position in that they have the distinction of being the only country to have to deal with this kind of nonsense, specifically with these terror tunnels, specifically with the idea that Hamas finds themselves in their place of comfort by raising children up to believe that the ultimate purpose in life is to die in order to take the lives of Jews, having to deal with the fact that martyrdom is the thing that seems to be the greatest and most highest place that you can reach in society. They have to contend with the fact that these people, Hamas, don't care about civilians and make it their whole life's goal to cater everything around the destruction of civilians, because they see that as yet another gift to Allah or another action that the Quran tells them to follow to. It's a ridiculous, ridiculous thing, and yet lots of people don't seem to be able to see it. It's a lie, but that's exactly what we're dealing with. I think it's amazing, by the way, when she says, I've studied the maps. If she has studied the maps, then that means she, on purpose, wants to see the destruction of some of the most righteous people, while at the same time looking at the benefit being added to some of the most evil people. It's wrong. It's completely wrong. Look what it goes on to say. It says, in reality, over 1 million Palestinian civilians evacuated Rafah before the IDF took out 4 Hamas battalions in that stronghold. And by the way, there's a reason for that, because Sinwar has spent a lot of time in Rafah, and everybody understands the implications of staying in Rafah. Bad, bad, bad situation. It goes on to say, most alarming, at the Munich Security Conference in February 2023, mere months after October 7th, the VP advocated for a Palestinian state. This push for Palestinian statehood, without addressing the ongoing threat of terrorism and the necessity to de-radicalize Palestinian society, sends a dangerous message and would be the ultimate prize for terror. And by the way, this is a very, very correct assertion made by the author of this article, because you have to understand that even with the Palestinian Authority, the leader, Mahmoud Abbas, continues to legitimize the actions of Hitler during World War II Nazi Germany. And this is something that is remarkable, because you guys saw the video. I translated, I'll put a link up to this video for you. I translated the words of Mahmoud Abbas as he justified Hitler's actions. So he's a person who hates Jews. He's a person that hates Israel. And very much like Hamas, he does not believe that there should be an existence of a two-state solution. And by the way, I want to point something out to you. I want to play for you a video, and this video is important. I want to play a video for you of a leader of Hamas basically saying he doesn't want a two-state solution, that they've never wanted a two-state solution, that what they want is they want the destruction of Israel from the river to the sea. Let me show this to you, because this is eye-opening. This is telling. And so when you go back and you look at this push for Palestinian statehood, you'll understand why it's a broken idea. Because when a woman like Kamala Harris says, I want Palestinian statehood, what she's saying is, I want death of Israel and the Jews. That's what she's saying. But let me show you this video.
إنه هذا المعركة 7 أكتوبر فتحت أفق لموضوع الرؤية السياسية، وهنا يعودون إلى بضاعتهم القديمة حل الدولتين. وهنا أقول مسألتين في حل الدولتين. المسألة الأولى، نحن لا نقبل حل الدولتين.
You hear that? You hear what he said? Let's talk about the subject of the two-state solution. We want nothing to do with the two-state solution. We reject the notion of a two-state solution. That's what he's saying. Look what he goes on to say. Watch this. Kamala Harris should see this video. This is one of the leaders of Hamas. Watch.
هذا مصطلح مرفوض، لأنه معناه أنك أنت لك دولة موعودة، ومطلوب منك أيضا تعترف بالدولة الأخرى اللي هي الكيان الصهيوني، تعترف بشرعيته. فهذه مرفوضة. نحن نطلب تحرر، تخلص من الاحتلال، ونريد استقلالنا ودولتنا.
In other words, we do not think that it is right for us to have a Palestinian state when it requires us to recognize the legitimacy of Israel as a state. We don't recognize it. As a matter of fact, we demand that they all leave. But he's not saying leave in the way that you would think. He's saying we demand their destruction. Look what he goes on to say.
هذا عدوي. أنا غير معني به.
Israel is my enemy. They're not my concern. I could care less about them. That's what he's saying.
دولتنا اللي هي أي دولة؟
فلسطينية.
أي دولة فلسطينية.
طبعا إحنا بالنسبة لموقف حماس.
الفلسطينية. والموقف حماس. So he's saying this is a Palestinian state that we're talking about under the rulership of Hamas. Israel is gone, out of the way. We don't want them. Look what he goes on to say here. This is very telling.
وموقف الشعب الفلسطيني في أغلبيته العظمى خاصة بعد 7 أكتوبر أظن تجدد الحلم والأمل. فلسطين من البحر إلى النهر، من الشمال إلى الجنوب.
من الشمال إلى الجنوب، البحر البحر. The vast majority of the Palestinian people believe in the river to the sea, from the north to the south, the removal of all Jews, the destruction of all Jews. This is the vast majority of all of the Palestinians that exist. This is their view. They want the murder of Israelis. So Kamala Harris, you can't go to dinner with a cannibal. You cannot. You cannot eat dinner with somebody who wants to eat you. Doesn't work. Look what he goes on to say. This is very telling. Every single college student should watch this one in the United States of America.
وهذا حتى كما قلت لك أصبح شعار في الولايات المتحدة وفي العواصم الغربية وعند الجمهور الغربي الأمريكي والغربي. الشعب فلسطين حرة من النهر إلى البحر. هذه شعار الطلاب الأمريكان وفي العواصم الأوروبية كذلك. مشروعنا الفلسطيني اللي عليه شبه إجماع وطني فلسطيني.
Look what he says. We're even using the college students. The college students are helping our position. The ignorant American college students are helping us call for the extermination of the Jewish people. By the way, isn't it funny when the college students get all upset, they call you a Hitler, they call you a fascist, they call you a Nazi, when in reality they're calling for the exact same things that the Nazis did. Yeah. When you say from the river to the sea, that's exactly what you're saying. It's insane. You would think that their sympathies would be towards a nation like Israel that allows the freedom of speech and your own choice to live the life you would want to, instead of giving it to people who will throw you off the roof of the building for living the way that you live. I always think it's really funny when you see these young girls wearing the keffiyehs, in their support of the Palestinians. If they walked into any part of any Palestinian world wearing a keffiyeh, they would not be allowed to live. They don't understand this. Look at what the article goes on to say. Harris commends pro-Hamas protesters. Stateside, Harris has praised pro-Hamas campus protesters as showing what the human emotion could be, revealing either fundamental misunderstanding of basic realities, a broken moral compass, or both. I would venture to say that it's both. The article goes on to say, instead of expressing strong support for Israel, as she has consistently done with Ukraine, Harris has berated Israel for fighting back against genocidal terrorists and consistently reprimanded it over the humanitarian situation in Gaza without calling to task the real culprit, which of course is Hamas. By the way, what do you expect? I mean, this is a woman who appeared in front of Zelensky before Putin went into Ukraine and said, come on, join NATO. Let's expand NATO. Basically telling Putin, come on, we want you to invade Ukraine. Let's build the war machine. It's ridiculous. It's evil. She did this on purpose. Harris represents a growing anti-Israel sentiment within the Democratic Party and the anti-Zionist progressives who will man the rank and file in a Harris administration see Israel as an imperialist, Jewish, supremacist, colonial state whose evil is only rivaled by that of the United States. These are not the makings of an administration that would have Israel's back. And that's true. Israel's trials aren't going away anytime soon. Once the war in Gaza ends, and perhaps before, Israel faces even a greater threat from Hezbollah, but the greatest threat of all is the Iranian race toward a nuclear weapon. By the way, let me just give you some perspective with respect to the Iranians. You have to understand, the largest missile strike in the history of the world was launched against Israel by Iran in April. And yes, Israel was able to ward it off with this technology, but it doesn't legitimize the behavior, nor does it mitigate or attenuate in any way the responsibility Israel had to respond with strong and very intense and powerful repercussions, even though they didn't. They bombed an S-300 battery? Come on. Who does that? If this was the United States of America, we would have carpet bombed every inch of Iran, every last inch, even with the Biden administration, or the Biden regime, as we would call it. It's amazing. This is hardly a time to cast doubt on America's commitment to Israel. Pressuring Netanyahu won't weaken his resolve, but it will increase the terrorists' appetite. Look at what the author goes on to say. Instead of steamrolling the Israeli government, all pressure should be directed at Hamas, Iran's other proxies, and the Iranian regime. As Israel faces multiple threats on several fronts, unwavering American support is more crucial than ever. A Harris presidency risks fracturing this crucial alliance at the worst possible moment. And you're opening up the door, by the way, for the judgment that we know will come if you violate Genesis chapter 12. We already know it. Look what it goes on to say. Without removing Hamas, the prolonged suffering in Gaza will continue to lead to endless wars. America needs leadership that recognizes this fact, as well as Israel's strategic importance and the moral standing as a democratic ally in a volatile region. Kamala Harris's record suggests she would do the opposite, jeopardizing both Israeli and American security interests. Appeasing Hamas is not the way to go. What a great way to end that article. Appeasing Hamas is not the right way to go. If you're looking for a reason to avoid trusting in a Harris regime, you've got the reason right there. I'm going to make this statement because I think it's important. And some people might be bothered by this. I think President Donald Trump will probably go down as one of the best presidents we've ever had in American history. But perhaps the single greatest variable that contributed to the success of America under the tenure of Donald Trump centered around the decision that he made to support Israel early on by doing the things that he did, whether it be the moving of the embassy to many of the policy changes that completely strengthened the position of Israel's security infrastructure, while at the same time growing the economy of ours. My point behind all of this is, if you're going to be a one-issue voter, the one issue you should probably look at, besides abortion, should absolutely hands down be, how do we treat Israel? What's going on? And Kamala Harris finds it to be a delight to curse Israel, thus cursing the very God that she hates. It's the truth. What do we have to do? Folks, here it is. It's simple. This is spiritual. We have to spend time praying. And folks, I've said this before and I'll say it again. When I say pray, I'm not just saying, oh Lord, please keep Kamala from becoming president. No, I'm saying get into the articles, read the stories, find the details in the stories, and start praying specifically against those details or for those details. Get into it and pray with a certain level of intention that you've never prayed for or prayed with before. The other thing that I would ask you to do, because you can make a difference doing this, is take the scope of influence that God has entrusted you with and use it. Talk to people, engage, have conversations, and watch God do something spectacular. Father, I want to take a moment right now to not only pray for the nation of Israel, the peace of Jerusalem, but I want to pray for the direction of the United States of America. I pray that you would frustrate the efforts of all who want to stand against you and embrace evil, and that you would bring to our nation a semblance of wholesome understanding of righteousness. That, Lord, there would be a spiritual awakening that would be so profound, so strong, so powerful, that it would even make Nineveh look like a small event. I pray that it would be so powerful, so significant, that when the rapture happens, the United States of America falls apart. Lord, it's our prayer for revival amongst believers and a spiritual awakening amongst those who reject you. We put it in your hands. We look to you. We ask these things in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless you guys. Keep fighting the good fight.